The Federal Reserve, what's their plan and why won't it work? I'm going to explain this to you in 7 quick steps. We're going to start with step number 1. The big problem here is debt, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. But before I do, first we have to get into the mind of someone at the Federal Reserve, and they're all trained in Keynesian economics. And what Keynesians believe is that demand and spending drive the entire economy. So spending produces income. Income for the entrepreneur produces more production. Production creates higher wages. Wages creates more spending. And you have this circle, which makes a lot of sense until you start taking it to its logical conclusion. Then we have the broken window fallacy. And what this is a kind of a Keynesian thought experiment where if you had a storefront right on the street, let's say it was a bakery, and some young kid came up and grabbed a rock and threw it right through the window. Well, the Keynesian would look at that and say, wow, that is awesome. Now what's going to happen is that store owner is going to take money out of their bank account because they have to hire someone to come in and fix that window. And that is going to be beneficial to the economy. Taking it a step further, they look at war and they say, wow, that World War II, that was fantastic because that got us out of the Great Depression. In other words, if you took a nuclear bomb and lit it off in the middle of the United States, the Keynesian would look at that and say, wow, that is great news. Now, because of all this destruction, we've got to rebuild again. That's going to create all this spending, and as a result, we're all going to be rich. And I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's actually what they believe. So we'll set that aside. Now you understand the mentality of someone at the Fed. They're typical economists. It's all demand driven. Going back to the debt, you say, yeah, George, I don't know if it's all about government debt because they've got to worry about employment, inflation, the economy, etc. But this really pertains to growth. Think about it this way. The government is over here doing all this profligate spending, and the Federal Reserve sees this, and they're responsible for getting us out of that spending problem. So the only way that you get out of that spending problem is through growth, inflation, or default. As an example of that, we've got Joe here. We'll call him Average Joe. He's got a credit card, and unfortunately, Joe maxed out his credit card. It's up to $10,000. So he's got 3 options. Number 1, default, or pay them back less. Or he could make more income so the credit card payments are less of a burden, and he could start to chip away at that principle. So using this as an illustration and comparing it to the federal government and the Fed, the default is the same. Default, paying less, that would be the equivalent of inflation, because if the Fed creates inflation, the US government is paying their debts back in cheaper dollars. So they're actually paying it back, but they're paying it back with less purchasing power. Or making more money would be the equivalent of growth. So the Fed says, okay, this growth is definitely the best way out, but then they've got this problem where they come in here and juice the economy. And let's say they can juice it at 10%. And I know they can't, but just for the sake of this example. But the federal government is coming in here and spending 7%. Well, this would actually solve the problem because pretty soon this growth is going to take care of the debt. Unfortunately, we've got the opposite problem here where no matter how much the Fed can juice the economy, the government is always spending more. That's why the Fed's biggest problem is the government debt. Step number 2. Now that we've discovered what their main problem is, we can start to understand what their plan is to fix it. And this starts with how do they generate that growth that we talked about in the prior step. Well, the old school way of doing this is they would drop interest rates. How would they do that? They would increase the money supply. That would drop interest rates, therefore increase credit, which would produce more spending. So a quick diagram on how that works is you've got the Federal Reserve, they print money to buy bonds. Those bonds go into the Federal Reserve, that increases the size of their balance sheet. That money from the bonds that they purchased, the money that they printed out of thin air, that goes down into the banks because the people that they bought those bonds from, they deposit the money into the banks. That lowers the interest rate. That's simple supply and demand because the more money that is in the banks in reserve, the lower the interest rate goes. So if the interest rate goes lower, the customers that are trying to borrow from the bank, they can borrow at lower rates, meaning that their income goes a lot further. This increases their purchasing power, which in effect produces more spending. And remember, if we get into the mind of the Keynesian, that's what they think is going to drive the growth of the economy. Step number 3, the new school way to create growth. What they were doing before was getting diminishing returns, what we talked about in step number 2. So now they said, okay, we've got to do quantitative easing. The goal of quantitative easing is to drop the long rates down lower, the long end of the yield curve. This is going to increase borrowing with things like mortgages and, of course, create more spending. And again, when we think about this like a Keynesian, this is their goal. That's what they think is going to be the driver of growth. So we've got the yield curve here, and in this example we've got 3-month treasuries, 1-year, 2-year, 10-year, and 30-year. So you can kind of see how it gradually slopes up. Investors are going to demand more of an interest rate the further we get out the yield curve because they have more inflation risk. So before, the Fed would come in here, focus on the short end of the yield curve, and that would naturally drop this whole thing down a little bit further. But when they came up with quantitative easing, they wanted to get this stubborn long end of the curve, which is more driven by market forces, down even further to juice that spending. So the Fed comes into the bond market, and instead of buying short-term treasuries, they now buy long-term treasuries specifically to artificially flatten that curve and to get these rates down lower. And you may be saying to yourself, yeah, George, I understand the low rates and the quantitative easing. I get all that. And what I'd say to you is you don't understand the whole picture. Now we insert step number 4, which is the new idea. That's when this gentleman came along, Mr. Alan Greenspan. And I drew Elizabeth Warren yesterday, so this is my best rendition of Alan Greenspan. Those huge glasses he used to have. So Greenspan has this idea of raising asset prices simply by printing money. And that printed money creates wealth with low inflation as long as it stays in those assets. And then you have this trickle-down effect because people feel rich, they spend more. That goes back to the Keynesian mentality. And you may ask yourself, George, that doesn't make any sense. How can you print this money and create fake prosperity without creating inflation? Well, here's the deal. If you printed $1 trillion and just put it under your bed, it wouldn't get out into the economy. Therefore, it wouldn't create price inflation. Let's look at another example. We'll go back to Average Joe here. Average Joe's got himself a house that he paid $100,000 for. Greenspan comes in, prints money that drives up the value, or the price I should say, of Joe's house to $500,000. Joe says, wow, I feel rich. Now the price difference from 100 to 500 was created strictly by printing money. It's fake wealth. But Joe feels like he's worth $500,000, so he starts to spend a little more of his income, and then what he might do is he might take out a little bit of equity here and there and spend that into the economy, and that juices it even more, but he doesn't take all 500,000 of it. And that's the way Greenspan figured you'd get this fake wealth effect with low inflation strictly by keeping interest rates artificially low and printing money. Of course, this creates a problem. Joe is spending all of his money. He's not saving a dime, and why should he? Because the government has his back. When he retires, he's got Social Security, and all of his assets are going up in value. We've got his house going up, his stocks are going up, his 401k is going up. He's getting wealthier and wealthier. He has no concern for anything. And what this does is it creates an entire society that has no savings whatsoever, and that is key. We'll get into that in just a moment, but remember that, no savings, and a society that's dependent upon government and asset prices continually going up. Now we know what the Federal Reserve's plan is, and that's low rates, quantitative easing, increase asset prices, and increase spending. That's the Keynesian approach. Step number 5, we're going to get into why this won't work. And to do that, let's take a look at the Austrian approach. In step number 1, we understood how Keynesians see the world. The Austrian approach is much different. As an example, let's use a very simple economy. We've got this guy that produces cattle. This guy produces corn. This guy produces cotton. The way these people increase their wealth is they produce more than they consume. It's a shocking concept, I know. But if this guy produces more cows, he sells them, and then he takes that money and he puts it into the bank because all of his consumption is taken care of, and he's producing more cows than he needs to, taking that money, putting it into the bank. This gentleman's doing the same, this person's doing the same. That's how savings is created. And when this savings goes into the bank, that is the money that's actually lent out to other entrepreneurs to grow their business. Juxtapose that to the Keynesian or the Fed's approach now, which is forget savings. We don't need any of that. All we'll do is we'll just print the money to put it in the bank, and the bank will lend out the money that we've printed. As we know, this artificially lowering of interest rates by printing money creates malinvestment. The same thing can happen here, where you can have an excess of savings that would drive down interest rates. So you may ask yourself, well, George, this Austrian approach, why wouldn't that create malinvestment? Because it potentially could drive down interest rates as well. We'll go right over here, and I got a quick bonus for you. Let me explain why this Austrian approach, why the way that they lower interest rates is so superior to the way that we do it now. So we have two business people right here. This is the Keynesian approach, this is the Austrian approach. And interest rates are driven down in this scenario by an excess of savings. Interest rates are driven down here by an excess of money printing. So this businessman takes advantage of these low interest rates because he can get a 3% return on XYZ investment. The problem with that is that when interest rates go back up, that decreases the amount of demand in the overall economy. He can't make any money and he goes bust. Interest rates in the Austrian example can go up as well. If there's less savings, less money, the demand for that money increases, interest rates go up, but this business person has no problem at all because what drove these rates down in the first place was what? Savings. So this economy can survive with interest rates at 1% or 10%, where this economy can only survive with artificially low interest rates. And it all goes back to what I said the step before that I circled, and I told you guys to remember. It's all about the savings. And you may ask, well, George, how would they stimulate the economy? They don't have any of the artificially low interest rates, QE, or any of this artificial spending and money printing. That is correct. First and foremost, this type of economy doesn't need anything to stimulate it. But if you wanted to stimulate it, what do? You lower regulation and you have a consumption tax instead of an income tax. Why? Because again, this promotes what we want, and that's savings, investment, and producing more stuff. What we have right now in our economy is no savings, nothing produced, and the only investment we have is a result of artificially low rates and money printing. Continuing on, why the Federal Reserve's plan will not work is step number 6. So we have no savings in the economy, and we have an economy with very high regulation. A lot of people don't think so, but we do, especially compared to 50 or 100 years ago. So this stifles the growth of a real economy. And this type of economy is the only type of economy where we can get sustainable, real growth. And the type of economy that we now have in the United States, the Fed's only option to produce that growth is to increase asset prices. But let's think about this. If they do that, the only people that will benefit are the people that actually own assets. Therefore, the only thing the Fed can do is create a greater wealth gap. And it's this vicious circle because the more they have to jack the economy because of all that government debt, the more growth they need, the more they have to increase asset prices. And again, the more that gap grows between the haves and the have-nots. Step number 7, the Federal Reserve's endgame. Well, we know that their plan for growth won't work because they cannot achieve this by doing this. So the growth option is gone. The default option is off the table because if they did that, they'd turn the dollar into toilet paper overnight. Now we've got inflation, but inflation, they know that they get stagflation, and that's only going to make the social unrest worse. Because we've created this fake economy, it puts the Fed into a position where the only tools that they have at their disposal to try to solve their main problem, which is government debt, is going to make the overall problem and the economy 100 times worse. To discover more information just like this, check out this content right here, and I will see you on the next video.